Welcome to the Democracy Differently podcast. I'm your host, Keith Hyams, and I'm here today with Joe Wolff, who is Professor of Values and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government in the University of Oxford. Professor Wolff's career has spanned everything from equality, disability, health, and urban policy, always with a strong emphasis on the importance of philosophy and ethics to public policy. Today, we'll be discussing the culture of democracy. Joe, thank you so much for coming.
Well, thank you, Keith, and thanks too for coming to the Blavatnik School to record this.
So we will start with the same question. In one sentence, what do you see as the biggest challenge to democracy today?
In one sentence.
Ideally.
The biggest challenge to democracy is people losing faith in democracy. And if you want a second sentence or a third sentence, it's increasingly struck me over the years that we believe we can be saved by laws and institutions, such as the separation of powers. But from quite early on in my teaching Hobbes, who believed the only way of limiting a power was with a greater power, I thought, well, don't we believe in the separation of powers? Don't we believe that different powers can be in balance? And I thought, well, maybe actually Hobbes is right. The only real way of limiting a power is with a greater power. So there must be a greatest power. So the separation of powers depends on people believing in the separation of powers. That is, people who have a power but not using it out of a sense of belief in the system. So I've increasingly come to the view that systems only exist for as long as people believe in them, want them to exist. It hadn't been a problem with democracy in much of the world until fairly recently. And now we're seeing a lack of faith in democratic institutions. So I think this is the problem.
Mm-hmm. So that brings us nicely to the topic of this podcast. So let's start with the basics. What do we mean when we talk about a democratic culture, and what does a healthy democratic culture look like?
So that word culture is very important in there because it's very common to have a narrow view of democracy, that democracy is a voting system. So we talk about democratic elections as if democracy is just what happens in the ballot box in appointing people to rule us. And in a minimal sense, that is what a democracy could be. We're simply an election to put someone in charge. But a democratic culture goes beyond that. When people talk about democracy, if they say, I thought we were living in a democracy, they don't really mean anything about majority vote. What they mean probably is protection of minority interests, free speech, people being treated decently, non-arbitrarily, being listened to. Now, some would say that goes beyond democracy, that's a liberal democracy, say, and maybe that's right. But when I'm talking about a democratic culture, I'm thinking about the things that happens not just in the election, not just in the election campaign, but what happens between democracies what happens between elections. Mm-hmm. I'm talking not just about elections, not just about campaigns, but what happens between elections. And here there are two types of things. One is protection of rights, individual rights, and the limits to democracy. And the other is governments responding to what they believe to be the disquiet of the people. Yeah. So if the government is doing something and there's wide belief that the government is wrong, the government then in a democratic culture either explains in more detail why they're doing what they're doing, why they think it's the right thing, explains the sacrifices, the trade-offs, but the ultimate goals, or listens to the people and changes slightly, as we do occasionally see. So I think a democratic culture is really revealed in how the government behaves between elections rather than what happens on election day.
Yeah. Is this something that we have inherited that's grown over time, and so we either inherit a healthy or an unhealthy democratic culture, or is it something that we have to recreate with each generation, that we have to constantly sustain?
So I'm going to say something very boring here, which is it's obviously both. You start from where you are, and you start from what you've inherited. if I could remember the famous Marx quote, I would roll it out at this point. But we inherit institutions from the previous generation, but we make them and adjust them and change them for the next. And here I am, particularly in the last few years, very mindful of something that was really associated with conservative thought rather than democratic thought, which is that institutions take a long time to build up, but can be destroyed very rapidly. So the burden of proof ought to be on those who are wanting to make changes. But what we're seeing now is almost experimental change that's highly ideologically driven, almost experimentally driven, rather than very thoughtful.
Yeah. And do we see similar patterns in terms of what the democratic culture looks like and how it can quickly disappear across all countries? Or should we be thinking of democratic culture as something that's unique to specific countries and that it'll vary a lot depending on what country we're looking at?
Well, things will do vary a lot. There's no doubt about it. I wonder if any two democratic countries are even organized on the same lines. There are very different systems. There are parliamentary systems, as we have, presidential systems where you have both a president and a prime minister, as in France, for example. So you have systems which are very different from an electoral point of view. That will lead to difference around campaigns. Campaign finance rules are different in different countries. I mean, the amount that you can spend in an election campaign in the UK would be gone in a day in the US. So we have very different cultures about elections. But we also have very different cultures about consultation as well. And I think this is one of the promising signs we're seeing at the moment, that we're seeing countries experimenting with things like participatory budgets in some cities, where citizens are invited in to discuss how some part of the budget will be spent. I'm hearing mixed reports about those in practice, that people who advocate them and are defending them think they're going very well. People who are taking a bit more impartial view say they're captured by the middle classes, just like everything else is captured by the middle classes. But still, we're experimenting with citizens' juries and different forms of ways of getting input into the public debate. I think where we are struggling more now is with the media. And it wasn't so long ago when everyone took a daily newspaper, and although every newspaper had its own ideological slant, you would occasionally see stories that you disagreed with or gave you thoughts or opinions that you had to consider. And certainly if you were watching television, you couldn't choose which channel you were watching because it fitted with your ideological views. You just had to watch the news, whatever it was. You might have thought it was biased, but everyone would have thought it was biased against their own personal view, whatever that was, no doubt. But we're seeing such fragmentation of the media now that it's not really helping this idea of debate and contestation. But I'm sure we'll come back to that.
So I found it interesting that you use the example of participatory budgeting, because when I think of democratic culture, it's something sort of diffuse beyond institutions. It's about how people feel when they protest, when they say this isn't democratic, how people treat each other and how political institutions treat each other, but not to do with the kind of formal rules of power. But the idea of participatory budgeting was that formally power will be delegated to a particular group of people. So should we think of culture in terms of something that's institutionalized, or is it something more diffuse that people themselves in a democracy have to foster? And if so, how do they foster it?
That's a very good point. Thank you. Yeah. So it's traditional to think of the state, the market, and civil society as three different spheres. And the sphere of democratic culture would be civil society rather than the state. The state would be where you have formal democracy. And so when I think about civil society, I think about people forming their own interest groups, so local history society, or even the occasional local philosophy societies. It's very interesting that autocratic governments are very uncomfortable with these type of civil society organizations and think they must be hotbeds of rebellion of some sort. So, the famous cases in Eastern Europe of philosophy societies having to go underground because they were under such suspicion, and police spies going to a reading group on Plato to see what was likely to happen. So that type of thing, also in Hitler's Germany, you pretty much had to sign up to the Nazi Party if you wanted to have any type of organization. So the idea of even having a group that went hiking that wasn't affiliated with the party was very difficult, if possible at all. So a democratic culture will allow people these forms of self-organization, free from the state, free from the market. When the internet started, actually I had very high hopes for that as the realm of this third space, because it wasn't a government thing initially. It wasn't a commercial space for a while. It was more of a hobbyist space where people were putting up their own websites about whatever it was. An authoritarian culture tries to shrink that space because it's very worried about any type of challenge. And I think this is one of the things that a democratic culture will inspire, this critical reflection, being able to consider alternative possibilities, being able to advocate for others, and having them discussed in their own way. As going back to previous question, every country will deal with this in different ways. Different regions within the same country may well deal with it in different ways.
So you mentioned the internet and the potential of the internet to enrich democratic culture. A lot of what we're seeing at the moment is the opposite of that. We see the internet used in ways that seem to harm culture. Do you think that on balance, technological developments, particularly digital technology, have helped with democratic culture, or have they been more damaging? And do you see a way to steer the use of this technology in a productive way in the future?
So I think at the moment, it has probably done more harm than good. Where it has done good is to allow people to go to trusted sources. So the university websites, libraries, the availability of information is just extraordinary. And for us as academics, I mean, it really is amazing the difference that it's made. If you go back 20 years ago, I might have had 100 books on my reading list because there was only one copy of each book in the library, and I had to make sure there was something for every student. Now I can put 5 books on the reading list because I know they can all get hold of electronic copies of it. So that just taken for granted what people can get access to and how many people can get access to the same thing, that has transformed the way that we teach. Also, it transforms the way that we understand thinkers. So I can remember reading 2 or 3 books of Kant. I think I didn't have a conception as a student of Kant having a collected works, that there were other things that he had written that I wasn't being told about, and there was nowhere to look for them. But now you go on Wikipedia or something and you see the bibliography, and then you can, particularly if you're a member of a university library, you can get hold of everything within seconds if you want to do that, whereas it would have been finding the library that had the one copy in the country and getting the interlibrary loan if you could be bothered to do that. So what was once a preserve of just specialist scholars is available to everyone. So in principle, that should be fantastic. So the internet making sources available. I think there are a number of factors, though, that have made it much more problematic. And I'm sure there are many, but 2 that just occur to me. So one is the being able to say whatever you want to say without there being a cost to it. And that sounds great, but what it means is that people might exaggerate what they believe. They may feel they have a license to say things that they wouldn't have said to someone else's face. So people feel emboldened to say these things on the internet. So people say things that are shocking, and sometimes they say it in order to shock. Sometimes they think it's this duty of honesty or something, integrity, to say exactly what you think or what you think is the truth. The other side of that is for the ordinary person who has come home from work, is just scrolling the internet, sees these outlandish views that give them almost a physical reaction. Of course they're going to block them. So these two dynamics, I think, have led to what's commonly known as the echo chamber. Yeah. It's not because people seek out only views that they want, but the license to say absolutely whatever you want without consequences, and the upset it can cause people when they're reading that, then means people shut themselves off. So that is, I think, the maybe unanticipated.
And that's leading to this sort of us and them mentality.
Yeah.
And a lot of polarization, especially in the States.
Yeah. So we've never had this before. We've never had a position where you can curate your own news. You've been able to choose which radio channel to listen to some degree. But even then, you're likely to be confronted with some views that you didn't agree with, even if it was for the purpose of debate and refuting them. But now, with the vast proliferation, people can curate their own sources and think they're getting the single truth. And that then goes along with a disbelief that others won't believe the same things unless they're somehow blind or prejudiced.
So that's absolutely that's the pessimistic picture.
Yeah.
Do you see any solutions to this polarization?
It's very hard. I mean, there's an amazing thing in some of Orwell's writings about how people were becoming more open to each other in a way because we were all listening to the same radio stations. And he was writing during the war when there was only one radio station anyway. So if you were listening to the radio, you were listening to the same programs as your neighbor. So you had something to talk about, and you might have a difference of opinion on it, but you could discuss it. And so Orwell saw this sort of conformity in our exposure to media, which he thought would help us get on better with each other. And it leads to a more communal existence. If people are seeing the same TV programs, they can talk about it. Now there are too many channels. It's very unlikely you're seeing, certainly not on the same day, other people are seeing the same thing. So I don't know what happens at school, whether people can even talk about the program they saw last night because they're choosing different things and the time stream makes it impossible. But certainly my school, you either saw Top of the Pops last night or you didn't see it, and there wasn't any other choice. So Orwell has this idea that if we're all subjected to the same rather narrow stream of information sources, then this brings us together. And we're being pushed apart by the proliferation. The obvious solution to that would be to have fewer sources, but we're never going to. That ship has sailed a long time ago. I'm sure we will learn. I'm sure there will be a new equilibrium point. Maybe there will be a recovery of state broadcasting, but at the moment, every trend is going in the wrong direction.
So let's talk about loyal opposition. This is something you talk about in an article in The New Statesman, which you say is a key component of democratic culture. Can you explain what this is and why it's so important?
Yeah. So again, this goes back to Hobbes, and in this case, when I was a student and reading one of the books, it was number 96 on the reading list probably because other people had numbers 1 to 95. And I haven't been able to trace it again, actually, but I remember reading this book probably from the 1950s, and it had that academic tone that the person who was writing it not only had read and absorbed everything that Hobbes had ever written, but had ascended to another level above Hobbes, and said, Hobbes's problem, okay, so this idea, would you ever say this now? Hobbes's problem, that he didn't have the concept of loyal opposition. And didn't say very much more about that. And I thought, well, what an interesting thing to say. Well, one thing, the methodological aspect and the arrogance of saying there's this one problem with Hobbes. But then I thought about it. I thought, actually, this is right. Because what Hobbes does is regard any opposition to the sovereign as verging on treason. That the sovereign is absolute and has to be obeyed. And if you question the sovereign, then you are in trouble. Whereas the idea of loyal opposition, and you get this, I suppose, with representative democracy and party politics quite a bit later on, maybe in Locke, I'm not sure actually whether it's in Locke or not. Certainly by the time of Mill, you would get something like this. And it's a very simple idea of just making a distinction between being loyal to the country and the system and being loyal to the party who happen to be in government at the moment. And you're loyal to the system, but you're opposed to the government.
Yeah. And
we have that in the UK, the idea of His Majesty's loyal opposition. I think that there's an official party, an official opposition party, because there's parliamentary question time, and there's a leader of the opposition who has a formal role. Now, that can go well or badly, but when it goes well, I think the idea is that there is a formally established role for an opposition party who will question the government, hold the government to account, make the government uncomfortable, but at the same time having unquestionable loyalty to the system of government. And that is what Hobbes missed by having this unitary notion of the absolute sovereign. And there are times when this has worked quite well. So those who argued for the loyal opposition in, say, mid to late 20th century, quite often pointed out that politicians across the party lines got on perfectly well with each other socially. They would talk to each other. You'd see them having drinks together in the bar. Then in Parliament, they'd be making strong arguments against each other, but they would be accepting each other as human beings and colleagues in a sense. But that idea of we're all in this together, we're trying to do the best for the country, you happen to be in charge at the moment, we understand that because you're in charge, the country is going in this direction, we think you're going too far, we're trying to pull you back. If we were in charge, the opposite would happen. So that for me is a type of healthy politics, where if people are on board with the project. Now it may seem very disappointing because it may seem rather centrist in this way, and that nothing very dramatic is going to happen. That needn't be so, because a government can have if they've got a strong majority, they've got a strong program, they can push ahead with that. But there's a question about how they treat the opposition, how the opposition treats them. So some years ago, there was a former philosophy lecturer, Tony McWalter, who had been an MP in the Blair government. And I remember meeting him and talking to him, and I asked him if the government ever paid any attention to the opposition. And I won't give you any names at this point. He said, if so-and-so speaks up, we know he's just trying to make a party political point. But if this person speaks up or this person, we listen, because we know they've got the best interests of the country at heart, and they may have seen something, an unintended consequence, say, of our policies that we haven't seen. So they will be like honest critics, critical friends almost, because they believed in the idea of the nation and doing best for the nation. And this was very recognizable in the people and how they conducted themselves over the years. So the sort of people who would go on television, sometimes even criticize their own party if they thought they were going in the wrong direction, rather than being utterly loyal to it. So that is the type of thing that I'm thinking about here.
Mm. So it's loyalty to the country, to democracy, over what will help one's party or one's career.
I mean, you will be loyal to your party as well, but not in an unconditional way. Mm. And just this, so loyal opposition really is about an understanding of the system. That it's perhaps more important for the government to think that these people are loyal to the system, even if they're disloyal to me. And you see perhaps Trump at the moment is blurring that distinction.
Yeah. Why should we be worried about this? I mean, clearly, I think most people are going to say it's better to have a healthy democracy. But in terms of the actual policies, take something like climate change or some of your work on specific public policies, health. How does it actually affect the policies that are made and the way that governments tackle these challenges if we don't have a healthy culture?
Yeah. Very good question. I mean, so I haven't thought hard about that. So you're right to pull me up on it. But my instinct at the moment is to think, if things are going well, it doesn't make a lot of difference. So if we are doing things that will reduce health inequality, that will improve the educational prospects of groups who are struggling in school, say, if we're widening access to opportunities. So if the government is acting well, then loyal opposition doesn't matter. And even if we take some right-wing policies, if the idea is to reduce the tax burden, say, and that is done in a way that's not terribly damaging, then that can be tolerated quite broadly, knowing that that's what the people voted for, if they did, right? But I think the notion of a loyal opposition is very good for when things are getting out of control or going in a wrong direction. And there being people who have a degree of the confidence of the government that they are well-meaning and not just making party political points, not just trying to get power, and say, look, you're going too far in this policy, or no, this is wrong, and this is taking us in the wrong direction. And so having these type of external critics that you're prepared to listen to, I think that's when the notion of loyal opposition is much more important. Because if you don't have that, you're going to just dismiss any opposition as purely political. They would say that because they're in the opposition.
So it's like the critical friend that academics like to talk about, who's telling you when you're going the wrong way.
So that's true. So critical friend is a term we use. I don't know where that came from. This is not quite a critical friend. It's because they are an enemy in a way. They are an opponent. They're a highly critical opponent, but not an opponent at all costs. So Carl Schmitt has this idea that politics is about the distinction between friends and enemies. And so he says liberalism isn't really politics because it's all about trying to be friends with everyone, and you can't. Right? So it's a Carl Schmitt picture I'm trying to oppose here, that politics shouldn't be about friends and enemies. It should be about sort of close friends and distant friends, I suppose, rather than friends and enemies. It's a very pre-Socratic notion, actually, that you see in Plato's dialogues, that politics or doing good is about, or doing the right thing is doing good to your friends and harm to your enemies. You actually see this in the types of views that Plato is trying to oppose. And Carl Schmitt and his followers were trying to revive an earlier version of that. And that seems to be actually where we are in American politics, doing good to those who voted for you and doing harm to those who didn't and might want you replaced.
Yeah, so the picture's not looking great right now. What, as individual citizens, can we do collectively to try and improve the outlook?
So I wish I knew. There are forms of activism, forms of support. I'm not sure signing petitions is any good. I mean, that is quite a big thing at the moment because it's relatively painless. Showing up in the street. If you do have contacts with people who can make a difference, use them. Talk, but also listen. Because I think we're losing the sense of compromise to some extent, that going back again to loyal opposition, we have much more the notion of you're with us or against us, rather than what are we trying to achieve collectively, and what can we do to widen the tent so more people can get what we want. So politics often is about joining up with people who have similar views to you and lobbying, and that's really important because almost nothing gets done unless there's a large weight behind it. But I think at the same time, listening to people who don't agree and understanding why they're not agreeing and seeing if you can get a wider coalition would be beneficial.
How successful has democracy been so far?
So democracy had such prestige, it seemed to be having such power, and even if it wasn't uniquely the best decision-making procedure, this message of inclusion and belonging to the people was so strong that I thought democracy would only get stronger and stronger. But we've seen what the political scientists call backsliding. We've seen countries where party democracy is being replaced by single party states that are pretending to be democratic. Although in a sense, they're bringing their people with them. So there's a sense in which even there's an element of democracy even there, because if the people were really upset about it, then they wouldn't be supporting the leaders. So we're seeing these sort of deformed, degenerate styles of democracy that have the mechanisms, apparent mechanisms, and apparent institutions of democracy that are not really democracy. So we're in a stage of decline.
What's the point of no return? At what point will it not get better?
So I'm very torn on this. On the one hand, ultimately I'm Whiggish about it and think that we're in a temporary decline and human beings are very reasonable and we're discovering more and more about each other and we're going to move more in the direction of equality and democracy with it. On the other hand, there were people in the 1950s who were coming out of the first post-war Labour governments where there'd been enormous nationalisation. I mean, I'm not sure that we really have got to grips with how much was nationalised. There's a very large part of the British economy had been nationalised. We had a National Health Service for the first time. Council housing was being built on a mass scale. Some ideas of at least workers' representation in the workplace, high levels of corporation tax, high levels of income tax. And there were people writing in the 1950s saying, look, they're temporary setbacks, but these are basically won now. No one is going back on this. Even people on the right wing of the Tory party are not talking about re-privatising or abolishing the NHS. So people think of this as the ratchet theory of history, that you hit this thing, there's no going back. Right? So what we've learned is that the ratchet is a bit loose and we get there for a time and then people have short memories. They don't realise why it was we created these things in the first place. They just see them and they see the problems. And they want to change, and in some ways that's understandable. So I'm caught between these two views. One is that I think there is going to be progress. On the other hand, I see why that can be an illusion at the same time. So I think I'm in the position of hope rather than evidence at this stage.
And so lastly, we always end on the same question. At the start, you told us what you thought the biggest problem with democracy was. Can you tell us, if there was just one thing you could pick for democracy to do differently, what would it be?
So democracy is different in every country. About 10 years ago, I read an article that said there was a flaw with the American-style presidential system, and that something like 30 countries around the world had adopted this system where you have a president and no prime minister. And all of them, bar one, had fallen into dictatorship at some point. And the bar one was the United States. And so now we're seeing whether even the United States can avoid falling into dictatorship on that presidential model. So one thing that I would recommend is that, and this may seem very parochial, there are a couple of things about the British system that are beneficial. So one is having the leader appointed by the party rather than directly elected. So not having that presidential system, I think, may be beneficial, or at least if you've got the presidential system, have a separate prime minister as well who has very clear and high level of responsibilities. But also the American system lacks an official opposition because it's a presidential system rather than a party system. So I think having official opposition and a presidential system would be, a prime minister, if you've got a president, the dual system, or just prime minister would be better. So that makes it sound like I'm saying British democracy is perfect, which I don't believe. But you asked me for one thing, and I've already given you two.
Improvement.
Yeah. But there are certainly things we could do to improve the British democratic system as well.
Joe, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. You'll find links to Professor Wolff's work in the description of this podcast. If you've enjoyed the show, please don't forget to subscribe and follow us on social media. I'm Keith Hyams. Thanks for joining Democracy Differently.